Welcome to Bookaholics, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking's podcast series dedicated to books. If there is one vice that all of us PICT faculty have in common, it's our addiction to the written word. So in this podcast series, we introduce you to some of our favorite authors and books, recent books, relevant books, our own books, but also classic books that we just can't seem to stop talking about. My name is David Selim Sayers, and in this episode, I'm thrilled to introduce you to an author whose book is about books. I'm talking about Grant Snider, the creator of the website Incidental Comics, whose caricatures, cartoons, and comic strips are regularly featured in newspapers and magazines such as The New Yorker and the New York Times Book Review, and whose moving and inspirational work we at the Paris Institute have shared more than once on PICT's own social media accounts. Today, we will be discussing Grant's 2020 book, I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf, which collects some of his most memorable strips and is perhaps best described as a love letter to books and the people who have made it their mission to read or write books. Grant, welcome on the show.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, Grant, because as I said, we often share your work via PICT social media, and it's always a pleasure to see both your work and people's reaction to it, which is always great. Grant, let me start by asking you some questions about, well, the book is about books. I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf is a provocative title. I wonder if in any way, shape, or form you were inspired by the famous John Waters quote, if you go home with somebody and they don't have books, don't fuck them.
I love that quote. I don't think I've actually heard it before, but I think it relates, yeah. Yeah, the actual title comes from a comic in the book where I'm feeling a little bit insecure going over to friends' houses and looking at their really extravagant, well-read bookshelves, then coming home and thinking about, okay, what if, these same friends come to my house and look at my bookshelf? What will they think? So it inspired a comic, and then from that I pulled that title.
Right.
Grant, I think grabs your attention, hopefully.
I'm sorry.
I think the title grabs your attention pretty well.
It does. It does grab your attention very well. And also what it does is it kind of sets up this idea of the bookshelf as not just something kind of that stands around like a piece of furniture in your home, but something that actually is a reflection of the owner's soul, or in and of itself in some way has a soul. For you, books are clearly not just something that you associate with whatever's written in them. In many of your comic strips, you seem to associate books, in fact, more with the people, the experiences, and the memories that they evoke for you than with their contents. It's clear that you regard reading itself as a way of life rather than as a means to an end. Would you care to elaborate on that a little bit?
There's a comic in the book called Stages of the Reader, which I think explains it better than I can. As usual, I'm better at drawing than than speaking the words. But kind of the cycle we go through from starting when we can barely read, or when maybe our parents or grandparents or teachers are reading to us, on to kids who are ripping up books and chewing on them and stuff like that, but interacting with books on their own, to young readers, to a teenage reader whose identity is kind of defined by books. From there we go on to a lot of times college students with really big ideas about what the books they read mean and what they want them to say about their own life, to maybe grown-ups who are a bit apathetic about the whole reading thing or just don't have time, to parents reading their kids again, and so on. So I think anyone at any stage in their life has a unique relationship with books, but there's different connections. So I'm sure you and I have read very, very different books, but we've still had the same kind of experiences throughout all the books we've read. And I think that's what's universal. And that's what I tried to show through in some of the comics here.
Right. So I mean, no matter what the book is, the relationship that exists between the reader and the book is something that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, we all have books we love and books we hate, and books that, we wouldn't admit to our friends that we've read. I mean, books that really define us as readers and as people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, talking about books, let me continue with a question on books themselves, because you steadfastly refuse in your work to pin books down to a function and thereby to allocate to them a status as things or tools or objects that are useful in some narrowly defined way. Instead, you seem to like depicting books as entities with which we interact in myriad ways, entities that stir us, influence, expose us to some things, protect us from other things, and challenge us in a lot of different ways. You have depicted books both as animals and as humans, but I do get the impression that both comparisons are insufficient for you. Are books, in fact, for you some kind of unique life form that you're in the process of discovering and introducing to us?
Absolutely, because like any form of life, they reproduce. So I have more books year after year and week after week, and they keep accumulating. And as much as I try to get rid of them, they still pile up. Whether it's library books or books I meant to give as gifts but kept for myself, or books I bought but haven't gotten around to read. So they're this living, breathing thing because they were made by human hands, but also because once they move in, they won't move out. Your question also reminded me of the different uses or functions books can have, not wanting to pin it down to one thing. So I recently bought from IKEA a filing cabinet to store my drawings, and it comes with that nice handy booklet of how to assemble the cabinet. And halfway through, half the pieces are broken or missing, and you're really frustrated. So I took this this IKEA booklet that I used to assemble this cabinet, and one of my young sons was looking through it or had taken it from my desk, and he asked me to read him a story. So I read him the story of whatever this cabinet's name was, and instead of reading it as a step-by-step instructions of how to assemble an IKEA piece of furniture, I turned it into a picture book or a children's book about this magical cabinet. So that book had at least two functions for me.
So basically, the openness, a book's openness to interpretation, as a matter of fact, or the reader's richness of imagination with which he or she approaches the book, is what gives the book its meaning in any particular case, rather than the book itself. Even if it's something like an IKEA catalog, I love that story. Rather than the book itself having this sort of limit to whatever meaning it can have. I think that's a really sort of interesting point at which to go a little bit into your own writing, because some of your writing does seem to serve specific functions. A lot of your writing is, in fact, about writing, at least in this book it is. One reviewer of your book has gone so far as to comment that many of your comics here seem to have been written to keep yourself busy during, or to get yourself out of a writing slump. So in a way, written as a substitute for quote unquote actual writing. And when I look at some of your motivational pieces for struggling or aspiring writers, I kind of see the point that reviewer is trying to make. But I also think that at its most inspired, you're writing about writing transcends its subject matter and morphs back into quote unquote actual writing, whatever, however one might define that. I'm thinking here of comics such as types of narrators or character development, which are strips that base themselves on abstract literary concepts, but subvert these concepts with visual puns in order to arrive at self-contained stories. Do you think there's a merit to the distinction here that I'm making between quote unquote writing about writing and actual writing?
So just to comment on the reviewer, I think this is only my second book for grownups. I've done a few kids books as well, but even this early in my career, I know not to read reviews, but but still, I appreciate you finding that and sharing it with me. I don't think writing should be held on, let's see. I don't know that you have to look at writing as such a high concept thing, and I prefer to think of writing as something that everybody does, whether you're writing a grocery list or writing an email to a colleague or, writing a letter to a family member. And in the same way, I don't make a distinction between, okay, I'm going to write my great American novel, which is another trope I kind of make fun of in the book a little bit, versus, oh, I'm going to write a comic, that may have 10 or 12 or 20 words. I think within any piece of writing, there's a potential for a huge amount of expression, and to just limit it to be like, oh, well, that's not real writing. It's, it's self-reflective, or it's, self-help, or it's a diary, or, it's not a great piece of literature. I think that would really reduce and kind of narrow your view to some great forms of writing. And back to kind of the first part of your question as well, where I started drawing and writing some of these comics on the writing process was actually with my first book, The Shape of Ideas, where I realized every time I sat down at the drawing table, what interested me was not so much the idea that I finished up with and the published comic or page or piece of work, but my actual thought process throughout the whole thing. So in this book, a lot of those stem from that, is like, okay, I'm looking at myself while I'm writing, and endlessly reflect, or I guess infinitely reflecting, that thought process back. So I think those comics can be a little bit frustrating for the people who picked up the book hoping to find an entire book on the love of reading and books and literature. But my message to those people is that no book would exist without a writer behind it. And I think that's something as a reader, for myself, it's easy to forget.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you. And the fact that you're sort of bringing out the thought process that, well, two things that I wanted to say about that. Firstly, what you said about emphasizing the thought process itself over the end result of that thought. In a way, it reflects kind of a bit of our ethos here at the Institute, at the Paris Institute, because what we believe in our courses, et cetera, for example, when we have a course that studies a work by a philosopher, is not necessarily to give readers sort of the packaged sort of 101 version. Okay, this is what this philosopher is saying. This is the result. But rather, how does this philosopher think? How can we learn to think like this person? Because in that case, if you can manage to do that, then you will not just arrive at the end result of that particular book that person.
The same conclusions as the person who's already thought it.
Exactly. But then you might actually take that thought process and apply it to something else, and that's what makes it so interesting. And secondly, what you said about not making a categorical difference between something like somebody's grocery list or something like the Great American Novel, to see all of these things as a sort of expressions on a spectrum, on a broader spectrum of writing. That takes me straight to the next question that I wanted to ask you. In fact, I think it already answers that question, because you talked about how your work can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Some people can approach it expecting some kind of comic book story. In other ways, it reflects more genres like self-help or how-to genre. Sometimes it comes closer to poetry, but it reflects a lot of different, the way you play with a multitude of art forms and genres is in fact very conscious and very self-conscious. So, it's almost redundant to ask you this at this point, but do you feel that this is something that you want to kind of process or work through or grow out of in the process of discovering what you want to write? Or do you think that this is actually a strength of what you're writing? This is something that you actually cultivate?
I wish I knew the answer. No, all I can say to that is what I found when I have a very clear idea of like how I want a story or a comic to end up on, I know exactly what it's going to look like, and I know exactly what I want to say. And as I'm writing it, before I'm writing it, I go into it and it just kind of falls flat. Either I don't finish it or it doesn't turn out like I want. Some of the most fun stories, books, comic strips, in any form that I've worked on, I go in there not quite knowing what I'm doing. I have maybe the vague notion of, okay, I'm going to write it in this form, maybe as a how-to comic or a list, or I want to, talk about this very broad topic. And then I kind of stumble through that thought process, and I end up with something that I wouldn't have imagined, ending up on. And I think that shows through, hopefully, to the person reading it. It wasn't like, okay, this writer, this cartoonist had this really clear idea and he executed it and it's all perfect and clean and boring. It's like, oh, he stumbled onto something pretty interesting in the creative process. And that makes it really fun for me. So I think as long as I have that open-ended exploration whether I'm trying to craft like a 300-page graphic novel about a certain topic, or just do a series of online strips. As long as I'm going into it with that openness, that's really what matters to me as a creator.
Right. Thank you very much for that. I think that's a very fruitful and wonderful way to approach art or any form of communication. As a matter of fact, I mean, not going in knowing what you want the end result to be, but allowing it to emerge in the process. One question, though, that I do have about your intentions as a writer is that. In a lot of your strips about, let's say, about literature, about literary theory, or about the literary canon, the infamous literary canon, you do have this. You already mentioned that you also write for children or write children's books, and I do get this sense in a lot of your, in a lot of your writing, in a lot of your strips, that the child's perspective, I mean, looking at things from a child's perspective, also influences the way that you write for adults. And I'm thinking here especially of the way that you use naive visual puns to construct comics about some quite forbidding or intimidating aspects of literature. What do you think is actually gained by applying this naive childlike perspective? Is it actually an attempt to make literature more approachable?
I think that's part of it. I think one, it's kind of an excuse for me to make dumb jokes, or dad jokes, I guess the internet calls them now, puns and visual humor on things like that. But as kind of an outsider to the literary world, or at least I consider myself that, it's a way for me to approach them and make him more understandable to myself. So I think I took one English literature class in college. I'm actually a dentist, so I took I've been in school for much longer than any person should be, but including my orthodontic program after dental school. But I don't have any academic basis in talking about the things I write about in this book. So it's me kind of as a layperson looking at these concepts, whether in a book I've checked out, or a textbook I found laying around, or maybe an article I found on the internet, and saying, okay, how can me, as somebody who likes to write, likes to draw, but doesn't have this, really detailed background in it, how can I make these things fun and interesting and appealing to myself and to other people who read about it? So I think that's kind of where that comes from.
I see. And related to that, I mean, it's interesting that you say that you have no literary background. I mean, I knew that you're an orthodontist. I had read that up, and that relates to your comic strip, obviously, about the writers with day jobs. Yeah. you could have probably added yourself in the last frame of that one. But what I wanted to say was, for someone who is from outside, or whatever might be construed as a literary milieu or a literary community, you seem to be also engaged in a process of imagining what you would like your ideal literary community to be through your comic strips. Something like, for example, that one page, one of my favorites is the literary retreat. Right, where everybody who loves literature is together on this island, and they have this wonderful castle that expresses all the different aspects of being involved with literature. And is that something that you're doing? Are you imagining, and through imagining it, trying to bring maybe into being somehow your ideal literary community?
I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, absolutely, David. One thing I was reading a lot when I was making the comics in this book was old Paris Review interviews with, different authors and poets who I loved, from Billy Collins, Haruki Murakami, various people I've kind of referenced in this book, back to people who haven't read quite as much, like William Faulkner, and just some of the huge names throughout literature. And I was like, oh man, I would love to sit with these people at a dinner party and just talk about all these things. In reality, if that actually happened, I would be sitting in the corner, like too afraid to speak to them, because I'm kind of an introverted person and I wouldn't feel comfortable in that situation. But in my imagination and on the page, I can have those conversations, and I can invite them to the writer's retreat where all these crazy things happen among writers. And one thing I have enjoyed, kind of pre-pandemic, was going to book events. And now I do finally feel confident enough to, if there's a famous writer coming to town whose work I love, I'll at least raise my hand and kind of shakily ask a question. I feel like I have now that I have my author card, I can ask questions at book events and hopefully attending more of those in the not too distant future.
Well, the way that you imagine that community in your comics is so much more endearing than any sort of physical manifestation of that community that I've come across in my life. That I just hope that more and more people actually read your comics and maybe sort of morph into these softer, more welcoming,
Never
versions.
meet your heroes in person, right? There's that saying, I guess. But I guess behind the veneer that writers put out, they're just normal people like everyone else, just
Right.
with strange ideas they put on paper. So yeah, I think there's certainly probably a lot more interesting and fun to be around on paper than
No, I
than at
think
dinner party.
absolutely, I agree with you. Grant, the next few questions that I wanted to ask you are ones that concern the book as a physical object, rather than sort of the book as a, I don't know, sort of a symbol for that literary community. When it comes to the book as a physical object, you are a champion that comes through in your work. You are someone who views the physical assembly of a bookshelf over the course of one's life as a kind of self-actualization even. But at the same time, you're a cartoonist whose works are perhaps predominantly viewed online in a piecemeal fashion. Your book, I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf, is in fact a collection of such individually published works. And some reviewers, I mean, you already said that you don't read reviews, so I apologize for bringing reviewers up again. But some of these unspeakables have remarked that while your cartoons work very well when read one per day or one per week, they don't quite have the same effect, or they're somehow somewhat overwhelming, perhaps, when your book is read in one sitting, cover to cover. What do you think of this? Do you think perhaps that there is something to be said for not turning work such as yours into a book?
So that reminds me of a quote, which I'm going to mess up, but there's one of my favorite poets. Her name is Kay Ryan, former U.S. poet laureate. She said, anybody who would read a poetry book from cover to cover, start to finish, is demented. So and that's that's kind of how I view somebody who would sit and try to take in I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf in one sitting. I do think it's probably a fun book to keep on the nightstand or the coffee table and open up and read a few at a time or flip through and take in the drawings one by one. But yeah, to sit down and try to read it like a graphic novel or a an ungraphic novel. In one sitting, I don't necessarily recommend that. So I think that reviewer, may be onto something. At the same time, though, I do think there's just something kind of romantic to me about having the drawings in the form of a book. They're all about books, so it just seems wrong to keep them lingering online. And online's nice to share comics because they can get passed around and viewed by, millions of people worldwide that would never be able to maybe see the physical book. But the idea that this book may be on somebody's shelf and end up in a box somewhere, maybe their kids or grandkids will find it in the basement and have to decide whether to throw it away or give it to a thrift store someday. That's just kind of appealing to me.
Yeah, I mean, so in a way, what you're saying is that there's a complementarity, in fact, between the sort of online dissemination and having them together in the form of a physical object. I mean, the one doesn't necessarily exclude the other.
I think so. I hope so.
So, well, the reason that I'm asking you about sort of online reading versus owning the actual physical book, I have to say that this is something that is not just something that I'm interested in theoretically, but it has a personal dimension for me. Through reading your work and sort of following the way that it relates to the trials and tribulations of book lovers, I've come to see you as a bit of an agony uncle for those of us who are hopelessly in love with books. And so, since I've got you here in front of me right now, I would like to ask you for advice on a very intimate issue related to books. So here goes.
Right.
Once upon a time, I also had a beloved bookshelf that had slowly assembled over decades and that resembled nothing as much as a beautiful collage of my entire life and personality. But due to tragic circumstances that I won't go into right now, my bookshelf and I had to part, and it was a permanent parting. As you can imagine, this was a deeply traumatic event for me. So now I go around having one night stands with PDFs, fleeting affairs with ebooks, and platonic relationships with bookstore shelves. But I find myself unable to make a real commitment to a new bookshelf of my own. Sometimes I even feel as if I could never love a bookshelf again. Grant, what is your advice for me?
Well, I appreciate you sharing, the deepest feelings of your relationship with books in your bookshelf. I think the best thing you can do is to find a friend or a family member who's your ideal reader, who shares the same taste, the same interests, the same literary passions as you do. Find a key to their house or apartment, and in the middle of the night, hire some movers or art thieves, load up their bookshelf and take it to your house or apartment and keep it for yourself. That's probably the only way, to make a clean break from the ebooks and the PDFs and to get back into the loving world of having a beautiful bookshelf of your own.
All right. So you're saying basically hijack somebody else's relationship with their bookshelf.
I think otherwise it'll be too painful to, kind of build it piece by piece, and, you'll still be drawn to the ebooks and won't necessarily buy the physical copy. So the only way to do it is just to go in all at once, and
I see.
Find that perfect bookshelf and make it your own.
I see, Grant. So basically, this is probably very good advice, but this is probably also the sort of questionable aspect.
A little impractical, yes.
Well, a little unpractical, and also a little bit on the sort of, So I kind of get the feeling that, I'm glad that you gave me this advice, but also at the same time, probably I'm glad that you're not an actual agony aunt for people who are parting with their bookshelves. Grant, I've really deeply enjoyed, loved this conversation with you. Thank you very much for this conversation about your book in particular, but also about books in general, which I think will be as interesting to anybody who loves books as much as you do, as much as I do, as your book. I Will Love You by Your Bookshelf, which is a gem for book lovers. So with your work on my shelf and your voice in my head now, I feel that I have come one step closer to grasping the ever elusive Tao of the book. So thank you once again, Grant.
Thanks so much, David. It's been really fun talking to you.
Everybody, this brings us to the end of yet another episode of Bookaholics. If you, our listeners, would like to support the volunteer work that we're doing at our nonprofit institution, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking, you may consider becoming a member of our community. You can find more information on how to join PICT on our website. In the meantime, my name is David Selim Sayers. I was joined today by Grant Snider, PICT's favorite cartoonist and author of I Will Love You, I Will Judge You by Your Bookshelf, but why not love you? I Will Love You by Your Bookshelf. That's a more optimistic sequel. And I hope we have the chance to challenge you with another PICT podcast soon. Goodbye.